little backstory here. When I was at the Young Turks at TYT, I spent a good chunk of, 2018? 2017 and 18.
17 and 18, yes. That
after
was
the storm.
After Maria.
After yes. Maria. And I was on the island reporting and getting, hopefully we'll be able to turn that footage into something very soon. But just on not just the disaster, but the disaster capitalism and the colonialism that has existed on the island for so long. And I learned almost everything from Salvador. Salvador is an attorney. He was the former head of the New York ACLU. He is a longtime independence supporter. I believe since, what do we have here? Since 1964, a member of the independence movement.
Well, I joined an organization because I remember being for independence when I was 6.
Oh, wait, I know this story. Yes, because you saw, right, I remember this story.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit. I would love to have you on more often to talk more about the history of the island. But let's discuss specifically the statehood vote, because if you're listening to the Democrats in the party on the mainland, and even some progressive Democrats, you would think that statehood is something that the left on the island identifies with. But when you go on the island, it seems to be just the opposite. And then, I learned through you sort of the process of how that all happened. But can we talk about like who has traditionally supported statehood and why?
Well, statehood was supported initially by the so-called then Republican Party. It was the Statehood Republican Party. Initially, it was the Autonomist Party, but the Autonomist Party was more in support of autonomy, of what is now called Estado Libre Asociado, which is some type of a relationship with the United States. I'm talking about 1898, 99, early on in the game after the invasion.
Right.
It became clear then that José Celso Barbosa, who was one of the leaders of that party, he was the main leader of the statehood, what was the statehood forces. They understood that the only way to be equal within the context of that relationship was to be a state. But statehood really has never been a majority movement in Puerto Rico. And in fact, this 52% that they obtained now from power, trying to distract the attention from other issues and trying to get support for statehood. Well, people, yes, I would like to be a state, but statehood has never been offered to Puerto Rico. The United States has never indicated what would be the steps to carry it out. What would be the minimum requirement? Normally it would be 66%. So we are not talking about just a territory. We're talking about a non-incorporated territory of the United States. We're talking about a nation. Puerto Rico fought for its independence in 1868 together with Cuba. The Grito de Lares uprising was suffocated immediately, but some of the Puerto Ricans who wanted independence for Puerto Rico went to fight for the independence of Cuba in 68 and then thereafter in 95 with Jose Marti. Some of them died there. Some of them became generals, like Juan Rios Rivera. It was too late. I think the United States recognized that. And that's why they established a distinction. We were not an incorporated territory.
So what does incorporated territory mean?
Those that are going to become states.
So like, an example would be...
Unincorporated is not to be, you are not going to become a state. I mean, that distinction was dealt with by the U.S. Supreme Court also in the so-called insular cases. Downs versus Bidwell being, I think, the main one. And in that, they justify having Puerto Rico being a territory of the United States, but not having any rights to participate. So it's a colony, but they didn't want to call it a colony. So they call it an unincorporated territory. Such is the language of politics, always trying to be leaders of the occult. Something is not very clear. So in the statehood has never been a majority in Puerto Rico. It is now more or less half of the population, more or less, could be supporting it now. But they do not realize what it really entails. If, number one, the United States has never offered statehood to Puerto Rico. Why is that the case? Well, because we're a different nation. We are a different culture. Now, it might be that Puerto Ricans residing in the United States ultimately, after 2-3 generations, really become American, who are descendants of Puerto Ricans. Mm-hmm. But it is interesting, however, that Puerto Ricans, of all the groups there, Cubans and Dominicans included, maybe the Dominicans are more like us. But the Cubans in exile, they are not for, you know their problem.
Yeah.
But we have always felt that it was crucial for us to maintain our identity. That is why after 3 generations in the United States, many still speak Spanish, mm-hmm. and identify themselves as Puerto Ricans. Now, obviously, Latin Americans, Puerto Ricans included, played a very significant role in the victory, in this electoral victory. Now,
Biden's victory.
And the women also, women of color and Puerto Rican women played a very significant role. That's why it went up so high, because you had never obtained 77 million, or 80-some million votes for just for one party. I mean, both parties grew.
Yes.
So we are not really part of that. Most of the people in Puerto Rico do not speak English. That's my wife calling, but I'm not going to
say hi to her. Your wife is also an elected official on the island, which is important. Not a bad person to call.
Now she's on. Okay, now she's on speakerphone right now, but I'm okay. She's on the southern part of the island working today. She was a candidate for the Independence Party for San Juan. Her sister, Maria de Lourdes, was the one who garnered more votes, 130-some thousand votes for the Senate. So the Independence Party only had 2. There's a new movement in Puerto Rico called Movimiento de Victoria Ciudadana. They have, many of them are people who come from the independence movement, but they decided not to identify themselves with any particular solution of status, although a lot of the leadership is. But they, for example, postulated, they had the candidate for resident commissioner was for statehood. So they want to include within their group people who are they are not a status-defined party.
Right. So when you say status-defined party, just so folks understand that, it's the parties, the majority of the parties traditionally on the island have not been like Democrat versus Republican. Mm-hmm. They're basically, it's based on whatever they want the island to be. Do you want the island to be autonomous? Do you want it to be independent? Mm-hmm. Do you want it to be a state of the United States? So I want to talk about sort of like the legitimacy of these statehood votes, because there have been previous statehood votes that have passed, right? But then when you start to learn a little bit more about, well, who was voting and how was the vote conducted, and then you start to get into territory where like, is this a sanctioned vote? I don't know. So can you explain how that worked in the past?
It gets involved with the local politics of who's going to win the election. The party that was in power is the statehood party.
Right.
Which no longer calls itself statehood party. It's the Partido Nuevo Progresista. That's since the 60s when it was founded. But it was really a continuation of the old Republican statehood party, because they were, Republicans of the Abraham Lincoln ilk. Mm-hmm. Because that's what they felt inspired. The people who supported statehood felt that Puerto Rico could be part of that. But we really, in 122 years have gone by, and todavía seguimos hablando español como nuestro primer idioma. We're still speaking Spanish as our first language. Mm-hmm. Most people who speak very good English are either who went to relatively private schools or who lived in the States for a while. The majority of the people can more or less understand English, but they are not completely fluent. This party wanted to distract away from the many problems of which have plagued them, and they wanted to incorporate a sort of a popularity contest with no real significance or implication, because the question is, what has to occur before a true process of decolonization takes place? Well, it is not simply because the party in power decides, let us see how we are right now and how that helps us win. No, it is a serious thing, which the main, as we say, let the mute man speak. The mute man is Uncle Sam. They have never said that they would grant it. They have never indicated what would be the conditions. The first thing that would happen is that we would become an incorporated territory, which means we start paying federal taxes.
Well, you're already paying taxes on both sides. There's the other side of this where you have the Jones Act, which is making the island extraordinary. It's like New York prices, to put this in perspective.
You're right. It's not direct income tax, but we're paying high levies because we are forced to use. We cannot bring things directly from the Dominican Republic here unless it's contraband. We have to. It has to go through Jacksonville, Florida, and then it has to be on U.S. merchant marine ships, which are more expensive. It's something that also the labor unions in the United States support because it means more jobs for the labor union. So that's an area where obviously it's difficult to join forces with the labor movement in support of the fact that we do away with it. Mind you, Puerto Rico cannot have any relations with Cuba. A Dominican who wants to come to Puerto Rico, the United States admits him. So we have been segregated.
And part of I remember you telling me this.
We need to be joined.
In the Caribbean, there's just been such a conscious effort over the last 200 years, 150 years, to separate all of these islands, right?
Yes,
and I know Carmen Yulín Cruz, she was
the past
candidate
mayor of San Juan.
Past mayor of San Juan.
Well, she still is mayor. She lost the election, but she's
right.
Right.
Because she ran for governor. But she would always talk about a unified Caribbean, like a group of Caribbean nations to be able to work with each other. But instead they have to go through these complicated systems where, there are many people on the island of Puerto Rico who I thought it was amazing to hear that they were Cuban, working class Cuban, many, I'm sure not all, but they couldn't go home to see their family. And there's just everybody's separated and divide and conquer, I guess is the best way of saying it.
And it is obviously done purposely. Now, obviously, it was the direct result of the fact that although the Dominican Republic was first conquered or invaded by the Spanish when they arrived, then the French took over part of the territory, and then they had Haiti. There is a lot of difficulties between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. In fact, the independence of the Dominican Republic was the overthrow of the invasion that the Haitians have made into Dominican territory. So there's a lot of tension there and other issues that I don't want to get into regarding that. Cuba and Puerto Rico have always, there's a poem written by one of Lola Rodriguez de Tio, who was part of the Lares Uprising in 1868. It's a canto a Cuba. He's chanting to Cuba. She died in Cuba, in fact. She's buried there because she had to leave Puerto Rico after the Lares Uprising. She says...
The Lares Uprising was an independence uprising, just to clarify.
Yes, in 1868. Yes. Cuba and Puerto Rico are of one bird, two wings of one bird. They receive flowers and bullets in the same height. Cuba y Puerto Rico son de un That's a poem that everybody knows. I mean, that fragment of the poem, it really means that there is and has been and will be very profound bond between Cubans and Puerto Ricans. There's a large Cuban community in Puerto Rico, not as large as the Miami community. But in the case of Puerto Rico, they mingled perfectly because it was almost transparent. We are very much alike. My father used to say that a Puerto Rican was a sad Cuban because the Cubans were very because we were sadder. We were a lot sadder in the 1940s. Puerto Rico was
the U.S. stripped the island of its land and its ability to produce fruits and vegetables. And of course, I think Puerto Rico has the best coffee in the world. And I mean, it's been it was a strategy to defeat the island's ability to be self-sufficient and to make sure that things come through the U.S. I can understand why
You see,
You're sadder people.
geopolitics has
You don't have socialism either.
geopolitics has played such a significant role. Why did they want to keep Puerto Rico? And how did FDR get the Congress to appropriate money in 1939 to build Roosevelt Roads and establish the
Roosevelt
Vieques?
Roads is a former base.
Was until the early 21st century. Early 21st century. I was arrested there in 1979 with 21. We were 21. And then a lot of other people.
1999, right?
No, 1979. 1999, it started again. It was the first.
Okay, so let's clarify because people, this is getting confusing.
Yeah.
Roosevelt Roads is a base. It is no longer existing.
It's no longer in existence, although it's still the property of the United States.
And I've been there, and it's very eerie.
Now, the reason why is it? Well, because how did Roosevelt get the Congress to appropriate money in 1938, 39? When he was saying that we're not going to go to war against Germany or in Europe. Mm-hmm. Well, they sent William Leahy to Puerto Rico. Leahy was a top admiral of the U.S. Navy, a real patriot, American patriot. He came here, and they expropriated the land in Vieques. Why? How did they give him the money? Well, they had a war game, which was played in Vieques in 1939, where the scenario was that
Vieques is the island that is right off part of Puerto Rico.
Right.
Yes, right off the coastline.
Right. The German Navy was anchored in the northern part of Brazil, and they make a move to take over the Panama Canal. The U.S. Navy was then in Norfolk, Virginia. Mm-hmm. The end result of the war games was that they lost the canal. Now, it was very clear for Americans ever since the 1898 and the William Randolph Hearst following of the Oregon that left Oregon and went all over to the southern part of Patagonia to come up to Cuba, that the Panama Canal was something that the Americans needed. They had not been able to finish it because of the mosquitoes, but they didn't find out that it was the mosquitoes until they went to Cuba and realized, because there was a guy there called Carlos Finlay, a doctor, who said that it was a mosquito. So Walter Reed and Bailey Ashford, who were the two main guys in the medical corps that came to Puerto Rico and to Cuba first, started developing what ultimately became the School of Tropical Medicine in Puerto Rico in order to develop the protocols to be able to continue the canal, which they started continuing doing in 1903. Now, mind you, the United States was the only Navy that could have easy access to the Pacific and the Atlantic. So how were you going to be winning the Second World War against? They were. You have to grant
geopolitically, Puerto Rico was always in a very specific and important position. But
It was closer also to the Atlantic, and a lot of submarines left Puerto Rico to defend the ships that were going to supply England in order to be able to resist the Germans. I mean, I can realize that, and I can understand why the United States would want to do that.
But okay, so today, though, I mean, it's not. The base is shut down. After a bomb hit, what was it? It was a bomb, right? Hit a guard at the.
That was Vieques. That was Vieques. No, that was not the reason why.
Well, they shut down.
Yeah, there was a bomb that killed a guy in Vieques, not on Roosevelt Roads.
But they shut down both at the same time, right?
But the reality was that it is not as necessary anymore, because now you have a different.
Exactly.
Now they have their own. They have Colombia is theirs. El Salvador is theirs. Nicaragua is. They have armies there. They have. So they don't need to have the same kind of defense. And they invited Panama in 1989 in order to be able to have assert control clearly over the canal. And they took Torrijos out because Torrijos wasn't willing to play ball with Poindexter to send them the heroin and the cocaine, the cocaine that was going to be used to fight Iran Contra, because the Congress would not have given money for that. And that was the Bush. I mean,
Right. So let's just to get back to the statehood for a second. So the island is no longer needed for geopolitical purposes. It's
I don't think so in the same way. No.
The population of the island is very large, although I don't know what the current state is with
it has gone down. It has gone down. We used to be closer to 4, and now we are close to 3. We had
3 million.
There are more Puerto Ricans residing in the continental United States than in Puerto Rico right now. There's more, about 5 million.
So 5 million. And then in the meantime, since before the storm, but after the storm, you've had billionaires and millionaires take over the island, buy up properties, take over, small companies. They have their own little goals to create their libertarian paradise and on the island. But the question that I have is, okay, so statehood, other than for, maybe an extra Senate seat, which is not necessarily guaranteed because there are conservatives on the island that might, you're a non-acting congressperson.
Once you become a state, then you have to secede.
Was Republican.
And you know what happened to the southern states when they tried to do that? When you come into the United States, you're not going to be leaving. I don't see it in the cards. I don't see Puerto Rico within the next 2 generations.
Okay, so the vote was approved, though.
In fact, what happened in this election was that the independence forces increased, and
interesting. So this is you've had previous votes. They were not properly conducted, meaning votes for statehood, and so they were not acknowledged by.
Well, this was not properly conducted either.
So explain, what does that mean? What does it mean?
Well, you really, if you're going to decolonize, you have to first, you're going to be asking people to vote for something. They have a right to be told by the power that holds power in Puerto Rico, under what conditions will that happen? What percentage are we expecting you to be able to get? What's going to be the main language? How long will it take? Because as I said before, maybe it's going to take 10, 12, 15 years. So we're paying federal taxes in the meantime, and we are
interesting.
Federal income taxes. Then we would pay. We are exempt from paying. We pay our own taxes here.
So why do they want statehood then? I don't understand. If it's not something, if they're not going to get a Senate seat, if they're not, what's the point? I mean, you're already punishing.
They feel more secure. Well, the U.S. military. There's a lot of Puerto Ricans in the U.S. military. The size of the federal government in Puerto Rico, food stamps, Medicare.
But they already receive all of these things without being a state.
Yes, but not in the same level in which they would receive some of them. We do get, we don't get SSI in Puerto Rico. In fact, I brought a case challenging the exclusion of Puerto Rico from SSI, 1978. We lost. We won here. A 3-judge court declared it unconstitutional in violation. Recently, another case is different in the sense that they were making arguments that we didn't want to make then because we didn't think they would prevail. So I basically hung my hat on the right to travel argument rather than an equal protection argument. But I didn't attack the whole question of the colony and made it into a bigger political issue because I thought that in 1978 when I did that, things were not ready for the court to solve that in favor. And I was ultimately a lawyer for a guy who had been denied SSI, had been given SSI in Connecticut because it was a migrant worker. I used to work for a migrant worker. Came to Puerto Rico, and then he gets a letter saying that he's going to lose it because he moved in here.
Interesting. So, I mean, this is a perfect example of how you lose rights by being on the island when you're a state or not a state. So, okay. So so you don't see this going anywhere. This is just some sort of performative vote. If it does go anywhere, it's going to take a very long time. And
I think that the American intelligentsia and the people in the early part of the 20th century, and I have a very high regard for the capacities of some of those guys and women also, realized that Puerto Rico was not you could not really assimilate it. This had 1 million people in Puerto Rico, had 1 million people, 960 some thousand people in 1898. Cuba had 1.5. and it's 13 times bigger than Puerto Rico. Now, it had 4.5. It lost 3 million because of the war.
Of course.
So it was so densely populated. Isolated towns, each one with its own very defined culture. This was a country, this was a nation. It was too late.
Yeah.
If you had arrived in the 18th century, maybe. But Puerto Rico's San Juan turns out to be 500 years old. Now in April, we're going to celebrate the 500th anniversary of San Juan, which was founded in 1521. Mm-hmm. So we've been around. By the time the Americans came here, we already were a country.
You'd been occupied by Spain and yeah.
But then we had our own mixture there because we have Taino population, which is more present Natives. Than people think.
Indigenous. Mm-hmm.
Even culturally, and in more than I've been reading about that and listening to some people who have studied that very carefully, and I was very impressed by what they have been able to.
Salvador, we have to wrap up real quick. So we have to wrap.
African people, yeah,
right.
We have to wrap it up, okay?
We have to wrap up,
but I wanted to say African. We had a large African population also.
You do, yes, exactly. I mean, it's a fascinating history, and I think we can talk more. I mean, we could talk about the forced hysterectomies on women. We could talk about the pharmaceutical industry on the island and how they were testing Puerto Ricans. It was written out. There were people being sent on behalf of FDR to oversee this. It's just a tragedy, and we'll see. Look at Salvador froze up just as we wrapped up. But Salvador Tio, if you can see if on my end, you're frozen on screen. I think the signal died out. But a fascinating history of Puerto Rico. We'd love to have you back on. Maybe we can talk about some of these other things as well. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.